The dog saw her first. That was the thing nobody talked about afterward. Not in the formal review, not in the press release the hospital communications team drafted and redrafted for 3 weeks, not in the quiet hallway conversation between the unit director and the chief of psychiatry that nurse Elaine Kowalski was not supposed to overhear, but did. Nobody mentioned that before any human being in Ward 7 made a decision that mattered. A Belgian Malinois named Ghost turned his head toward the door, looked at Elaine, and stopped growling. She hadn't meant to be there. She was supposed to be on her break. 14 minutes left of it, actually. She'd been counting the way you count when a shift has already taken something from you and you're trying to hold on to whatever's left. She'd been sitting in the family lounge at the end of the south corridor with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at the window that faced the parking garage, thinking about absolutely nothing, because sometimes that is the only thing that keeps you functional. She heard the commotion from 40 feet away. Not a fight, not yet. More like the sound of a situation becoming something it wasn't supposed to become. Raised voices flattened into institutional calm, feet moving too quickly on linoleum, a door opening and closing and opening again. Elaine knew that sound. After 7 years of psychiatric nursing at Ridgemont General in Hamilton, Ontario, she had learned to read the acoustics of a ward the way a sailor reads water. Something was wrong in room 14. She threw her coffee out and went. What she found was this: Staff Sergeant Marcus Vail, retired, Canadian Forces, 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 more in a classified context that his file referenced obliquely and she would not fully understand until much later, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed with his back against the wall and his left hand gripping the collar of a 70-pound working dog. His right arm was in a partial cast. His face was the face of a man who had learned a very long time ago that stillness was survival, and who was currently failing to be still. Across from him, 2 orderlies stood at a distance that was technically safe and practically useless. Between them, a charge nurse named Fenwick, tall, efficient. Elaine had worked with him for 2 years without ever quite understanding him, was explaining hospital policy in a tone of careful professional authority. The dog wasn't barking anymore. The dog was doing something worse, watching. Ghost was a military working dog, retired same as Vail, same unit, same year. That was in the chart. What the chart didn't fully capture was what Elaine saw when she stepped into the doorway, the way the dog's body was positioned directly between Vail and everyone else in the room. Not aggressive, not cowering, just present. A particular kind of presence that Elaine had seen once before, in a different context that she would think about for the rest of her career. Her father had come home from Kandahar in 2009. She had been 17. She didn't say anything for a moment. She just stood in the doorway, and Ghost looked at her, and she looked at Ghost. Fenwick turned. "Kowalski, this doesn't require. What's the policy issue?" she asked. "The animal cannot remain on the ward. It's not a registered therapy animal under hospital protocol, and the patient is refusing. He's a certified medical alert dog," Vail said. His voice was flat in the way that means someone has worked very hard to keep it that way. "He's been certified for 4 years. The paperwork is in the bag on the chair. The certification you're describing pertains to community settings," Fenwick said. "Our psychiatric ward has specific protocols. He's why I came in." Vail's grip on the collar tightened slightly, not from aggression but from something that looked like the effort of keeping himself inside his own body. "If he goes, I go." There was a silence. Elaine looked at the bag on the chair. She looked at Fenwick. She looked at the 2 orderlies, who were both looking at the floor in the way people look at the floor when they are hoping someone else will make a decision. "I can review the certification," she said. Fenwick looked at her. "You're on break." "I'm aware." She walked into the room, not fast, not slow. She kept her body sideways, angled slightly away from Vail, because she had learned from her father that direct approach felt like confrontation even when it wasn't meant to. She pulled the bag from the chair. Vail tracked the movement but didn't object and unzipped the outer pocket. The documents were there, laminated, organized. The kind of organization that comes from having to prove something over and over again. She read them. She took her time reading them because rushing would have been wrong in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Ghost, in her peripheral vision, sat down, not lay down, sat, the way a dog sits when it has decided something. When she looked up, Vail was watching her. His eyes were the color of old ice, and they were doing what combat-trained eyes did, assessing threat, calculating exit, running a continuous silent math of the room. But there was something else in them, too. Something she recognized from years ago, from a kitchen table in Brantford on a Tuesday evening, from her father's face over a cup of tea he wasn't drinking. He was exhausted, not sleepy, exhausted in the way that goes into the bones and stays there. His certifications are current, Elaine said. She looked at Fenwick directly. Under Section 2.3 of Ontario's Blind Persons' Rights Act and the broader federal framework for medical alert animals, this dog has legal right of access. The hospital's internal protocol cannot override provincial and federal legislation. Fenwick's expression did the thing expressions do when someone has said something technically correct at an inconvenient moment. "I'll need to verify that with administration," he said. "Absolutely," Elaine said. "I'll stay here while you do." It wasn't a challenge. She said it exactly the way she said everything, evenly, without performance. But Fenwick heard what was underneath it, and so did the orderlies, and after a pause that lasted approximately 4 seconds, Fenwick nodded and left the room. The orderlies filed out behind him. Elaine stood in the room with Marcus Vail and a dog named Ghost. She should have left. Her break was almost over. She had a patient in room 9 who needed her medication log updated, and a family meeting at 3, and a stack of documentation that had been following her around all shift like a second shadow. She didn't leave. She pulled the chair away from the wall, slowly, no sudden movements, the way you learn to do things in rooms where the air was still carrying electricity, and sat down about 6 feet from the bed, not facing Vail directly, more at an angle, like she'd just happened to sit there. Ghost watched her for a moment, then he put his chin on his paws. "He doesn't do that with people he doesn't trust," Vail said. His voice had changed. Not softer exactly, less compressed. "He seems like a good judge," Elaine said. Silence. Not uncomfortable silence, or at least Elaine decided it wasn't going to be, and so it wasn't. "You know what the certification is," Vail said. It wasn't quite a question. "My dad came home from Afghanistan in 2009, she said. "I had a lot of years to learn what mattered and what was paperwork." Another silence. This one different. "Is he okay?" Vail asked. It surprised her that he asked. People usually didn't when she mentioned it in clinical contexts. They nodded and moved on. "Better," she said. It took a while. Vail looked at the ceiling. "Yeah," he said. "It does." What happened over the next 18 days was not dramatic in the way that hospital stories usually are. There was no single scene, no turning point that Elaine could have shown someone and said, "Here, this is where it changed." It was more like the kind of change that happens in weather, gradual and ambient and only visible in retrospect. She checked in when she could. She was not Ghost's nurse, not exactly. She had her own patients, her own load, a ward that was perpetually understaffed in the way that psychiatric wards across the country were perpetually understaffed, for reasons that were structural and political and depressing to think about too directly. But room 14 was on her route, and she made a habit of routes. Ghost learned her footsteps within 3 days. She could tell because he stopped lifting his head when she walked past and started just moving his eyes. That was what she noticed first. Then she noticed that Vail had started leaving his door slightly open. She did not read too much into these things. She had learned from her father that you didn't narrate recovery to the person living it. You just showed up. You kept showing up. You let them decide what to do with that. What she did do was her job. She did her job with a particular kind of attention in room 14. She checked the documentation. She cross-referenced the standing orders. She read the notes that the other nurses left in the system, and she read them carefully. The way you read things when you're looking not just for what's there, but for what isn't. She noted that the occupational therapist consult from day 4 had recommended keeping Ghost in the room during all therapeutic interactions, and that this recommendation appeared in the chart exactly once and was never mentioned again. She noted that the psychiatrist overseeing Vail's care, a Dr. Aldred who had the kind of professional confidence that sometimes skipped the step of asking questions, had written an order on day 6 for a medication adjustment that reduced Vail's capacity for sleep significantly and increased his hypervigilance. She noted that this order had been written following a 10-minute session that the chart described as patient uncooperative. She noted that Vail hadn't been uncooperative. He'd been having a flashback, and Ghost had been pulling him through it, and Aldred had walked in during the middle of it and interpreted what he saw as aggression. She noted these things in the careful, neutral language of clinical observation. She also, on day 9, knocked on room 14's open door at 6:47 in the morning, before rounds, before the ward got loud, and said quietly, "Good morning." And Vail said, "Good morning" back. And Ghost stood up and stretched, and came over to press his head briefly against her knee. It was the first time Ghost had approached her. She did not make a thing of it. She just scratched behind his ear once and went to get her reports. But she thought about it for the rest of the day. On day 11, Vail's sister arrived. Her name was Elaine, and she had driven 4 hours from Sudbury, and she was the kind of person who filled rooms without meaning to. Not loudly, but with a quality of solidity, of being completely and entirely present wherever she stood. She looked like Marcus in the way that siblings look alike when you know what to look for. Same stillness around the eyes, same way of taking in a room before committing to it. She found Elaine at the nurse's station and asked, without preamble, how is he actually doing? Not a question, a need for a true answer. Elaine looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Can we talk somewhere that isn't the hallway?" They sat in the family lounge, the same one where Elaine had been on her break when everything started. And Lorraine held a paper cup of bad coffee, and Elaine told her what she knew. Not everything that was in the chart. The things that mattered. She told her that Marcus was not the problem. She told her that the system around him was creating obstacles that were making it harder for him to do the work of getting better. She told her that Ghost was essential, that this was not sentiment but clinical reality, and that there were people in the hospital who did not understand this. Lorraine listened without interrupting. When Elaine finished, she said, "What can I do?" "Be here," Elaine said. "And if anyone tries to remove the dog, don't let them do it quietly." Lorraine looked at her for a long moment. "You've been watching out for him," she said. Elaine shook her head. "I've been doing my job." "That's the same thing," Lorraine said. "It shouldn't be, but it is." The issue with Dr. Aldred came to a head on day 14. It was not the first time. There had been a conversation on day 7 about the medication order, which Elaine had raised through the appropriate channels in the appropriate language, and which had been reviewed and upheld with the notation that the attending physician's clinical judgment superseded nursing concern. There had been a second conversation on day 10 about the OT recommendation that was being ignored, which had produced a follow-up meeting that produced a memo that produced nothing. On day 14, she walked into room 14 at the beginning of her shift and found Ghost in the corridor. He was sitting outside the closed door. His harness was on. His leash was clipped to the door handle. He was not distressed in the way that would have constituted an emergency, but he was not okay either. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the way his gaze kept returning to the closed door. Inside, she could hear voices. She knocked once and opened the door without waiting, which was technically a violation of protocol and which she did not care about in that moment at all. Aldred was standing at the foot of the bed. He had a resident with him, a young man who looked like he was trying very hard to disappear into the wall. Vail was sitting on the bed with the controlled stillness that Elaine had come to recognize as his version of barely holding on. "What's he doing in the hall?" Elaine asked. Aldred turned. He was not a cruel man, she did not think. He was an efficient man, and efficiency had led him somewhere that cruelty and efficiency could sometimes converge without the person noticing. "The animal was creating a disruption during our session," Aldred said. "What kind of disruption?" "He was alerting." Elaine looked at Vail. "Were you having an episode?" Vail's jaw tightened, starting to. She looked at Aldred. Ghost was doing exactly what he's trained to do. He was providing medical support during a psychiatric episode. "You removed the medical support." Kowalski. "I'd like to know the clinical rationale," she said, "for removing a certified medical alert animal during the exact circumstance for which he is trained and certified." The resident had found something very interesting to look at on the floor. Aldred's voice took on the quality of patience being imposed rather than felt. "Nursing staff don't typically weigh in on—" "I'm not weighing in on your therapeutic approach," Elaine said. She kept her voice completely even. This was a skill she had worked on for years, the skill of sounding calm when she was not. "I'm asking a clinical question about a documented intervention that was contraindicated by the patient's care plan. The care plan is under review. Since when? A pause, too long to be comfortable. I wasn't notified of a care plan review, she said. Neither was the OT. Neither, from what I can tell, was the patient. She looked at Vail. Were you told your care plan was under review? No, Vail said. She turned back to Aldred. I'd like to document this conversation, she said, for the record. Aldred left the room 11 minutes later. He did not say anything on his way out. He walked past Ghost in the hallway without acknowledging him, and Ghost watched him go with an expression that Elaine, in a different context, might have found funny. She brought Ghost back into the room. Vail watched her unclip the leash from the door handle and hand it to him. Ghost immediately moved to the bed and pushed his head under Vail's hand, and something in Vail's face shifted in the way that things shift when a person has been alone somewhere and someone arrives. You're going to get in trouble, Vail said. Possibly, Elaine said. You shouldn't have to. No, she agreed. I shouldn't. She filed the incident report that afternoon. She filed it through the formal clinical risk management system, which meant it went to the unit director, the risk management coordinator, and the patient advocate's office simultaneously. She used language that was precise and careful and completely unambiguous. She described the removal of Ghost during an active psychiatric episode. She described the undisclosed care plan review. She referenced the OT recommendation that had been documented and then operationally ignored. She attached the certification documents for Ghost, the relevant sections of provincial and federal legislation, and a copy of the hospital's own policy on medical alert animals, Section 4.7, which she had found in the policy database at 11:30 the previous night after the rest of the ward had gone quiet. She did not describe what she felt, because that was not what the report was for. What she felt was this, tired and steady and absolutely certain. The unit director called her into his office the next morning. His name was Goran Karenyi, and he had been running Ward 7 for 11 years, and Elaine respected him with the specific and limited respect she gave to managers who were decent people operating within systems that made decency difficult. He looked at her across his desk with an expression she couldn't entirely read. This report is going to cause complications, he said. The situation is causing complications, Elaine said. The report is describing them. Karenyi was quiet for a moment. He tapped his pen against his desk 3 times, a habit she'd noticed before. Aldred has been on staff for 14 years. I know. You understand what you're doing? Yes. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, the patient advocate's office is going to want to speak with you. I know that too. Is there anything in this report that isn't accurate? She met his eyes. No. He nodded. Once. Then he said, okay, and she understood that this was not approval exactly, but it was something. Something he was giving her. She took it. The patient advocate assigned to the case was a woman named Sylvie Bouchard, who was originally from Moncton and had the kind of manner that made you feel, in the first 30 seconds of conversation, that she had genuinely read everything. She had genuinely read everything. She sat across from Elaine in a small meeting room with Elaine's incident report and a series of her own notes, and she asked questions that were careful and thorough and occasionally arrived at exactly the part of the story Elaine had been trying to decide whether to include. The care plan review, Bouchard said on the second day of their conversations. You've noted it was undisclosed. Were there other undisclosed changes? There were adjustments in the medication orders on days 6 and 12 that weren't reflected in the nursing handover notes, Elaine said. Were they reflected anywhere? In the physician's own notations, not communicated to the nursing team. Bouchard wrote something down. And the OT recommendation, she said. You've noted it was made on day 4 and not implemented. Do you know why? It's not documented anywhere, Elaine said. Which is itself a documentation issue. Yes, Bouchard said, and she said it in the voice of someone who already knew and had been waiting for someone else to say it. It is. The review took 9 days. Elaine went to work during those 9 days, and she cared for her patients, and she answered questions when she was asked, and she did not talk about it in the break room, which was hard, because the break room was where the ward breathed, and people had questions. She understood the questions. She didn't answer them, because this was not a break room story yet. Maybe it would be, after. Maybe it wouldn't. On the 5th day of the review, Aldred's clinical access to Ward 7 was placed under administrative supervision. He was still on staff. He was not in charge of room 14 anymore. On the 8th day, Vail's new care team held a planning meeting that included Vail, Ghost, Lorraine, the OT, a new attending psychiatrist, and Elaine in her capacity as primary nurse. Ghost lay under the table during the entire meeting, and nobody asked him to leave. On the 9th day, Elaine got a call from Bouchard's office. The review was complete. She could come in to receive the findings. The findings were 62 pages. Bouchard walked her through the summary. Aldred's conduct had been found to deviate from standard of care in 3 documented instances. The hospital's implementation of its own medical alert animal policy had been found to be inconsistently applied across the psychiatric unit in patterns that disproportionately affected veterans and other patients with complex trauma presentations. The review recommended mandatory training, a revised policy framework, and a formal review of all cases handled under Aldred's unsupervised authority in the previous 2 years. There was a phrase in the executive summary that Elaine read twice. The nursing staff member who initiated this review demonstrated exceptional adherence to patient advocacy principles and clinical documentation standards. Her actions are consistent with the highest professional obligations of the nursing vocation. She read it twice, and then she set it down, because there was work to do. Marcus Vail was discharged on a Thursday morning in early November. The light outside the hospital windows was the particular gold of Ontario autumn, the kind that only lasts about a week before the gray moves in, and Elaine thought it was a good day for it. She was not scheduled to be the one who walked him out. That was the role of the attending, technically, but she was on the ward, and he stopped at the nurse's station on his way past. He was moving better, still careful, still contained, but with a different quality to the containment, less like a wall and more like a choice. Ghost was beside him in full harness. He looked at Elaine, and his tail made one slow wag, the canine equivalent of a formal acknowledgement. "How's the arm?" she asked. "Cast comes off in 3 weeks." He paused. "They gave me a referral to the Veterans Outpatient Program at the West Campus. "I know that program," she said. "It's good. Bouchard's office told me what you filed," he said. She didn't say anything. "I want you to know." He stopped. Started again. "It mattered, that you didn't just file it and move on, that you stayed." He looked at the wall somewhere above her head, then back at her. "My sister said you told her to make noise if they tried to take Ghost quietly." "Good advice in general," Elaine said. Something shifted in his face, the smallest thing. Not quite a smile. She wasn't sure Marcus Vail did quite smiles, and she suspected that was okay. That was just his face doing what his face did. But something in the direction of one. "Yeah," he said. "Good advice." Ghost pressed his nose briefly against Elaine's hand. She let him. Vail nodded at her, once, the way you nod at someone when words aren't the right size for what you mean. And then he walked down the corridor toward the elevator, Ghost beside him, and Lorraine fell into step from where she'd been waiting near the doors. And Elaine watched them go until the elevator closed. Then she picked up the chart she'd been working on before he stopped, and she sat back down, and she went back to work. 3 months later, she was sitting on the planning committee for Ward 7's new trauma-informed care training program. Mandatory for all clinical staff, developed in partnership with 3 veterans organizations and a working animal certification body out of Guelph. The committee met on Tuesday evenings in a room that smelled like stale coffee and had a broken ceiling tile that nobody had fixed since September. She had gotten the invitation from Karenyi's office on a Monday morning with a subject line that said only, "Thought you'd want to be involved." She had in fact wanted to be involved. The training program had a module on medical alert animals. It had a module on trauma presentation in veterans and first responders. It had a module on documentation as patient protection, which was the one Elaine had written most of herself, at the kitchen table of her apartment in Hamilton on 3 consecutive Sunday afternoons, with a cup of tea going cold beside her, and the words coming slowly but coming right. The module began with a line she'd been thinking about since November. The most important thing a nurse can do is see what is actually in front of her. She'd written it, and then she'd sat with it for a while, and then she'd left it in. Ghost had taught her that. Not in any way she could explain in a training document. The way he'd sat down in the doorway that first morning. The way he'd made a decision about her before any human in the room had. The way he'd moved to press his head against Vail's hand in the moment that mattered, and the way Vail had let him. You don't always know which moment is going to be the one that changes the shape of everything after it. Usually you only know afterward, looking back, and the moment is smaller than you expected. A door slightly open, a dog that stopped growling, a woman who decided to stay past the end of her break. Elaine Kowalski had 17 minutes left of her break that morning. She used none of them. She had never, in 7 years of psychiatric nursing, regretted that.